How are you? So we've got
Sandra.
our second topic, which is amazing, unipolar depression versus the bipolar spectrum. And I'm so delighted to have these guys here. They are amazing speakers, amazing humans. Let me tell you a little bit about them. Sarah Schley is a business consultant, a social change entrepreneur, a speaker, and an author who has led systemic transformation at companies across the world. She's done lots of interesting things. She's a mother, a grandmother, a community leader, and has been married for 26 years to a guy who I hear is pretty great. She also has a bipolar 2 brain. That means she's on the bipolar spectrum, which she kept a secret, mostly a secret for 4 decades. Until now, she's written an amazing memoir. It's called Brainstorm, From Broken to Blessed on the Bipolar Spectrum. And Sally's going to throw the link in the chat there, where she tells her story in order to save lives and the stigma, maximize healing. It's a great book. I have read it. It's really, I can recommend it wholeheartedly. And the memoir is currently the inspiration for an upcoming documentary about bipolar disorder called Brainstorm the Film. So both of those are amazing. We are delighted to have her. Thank you, Sarah. And Dr. Jim Phelps. I got to say, Dr. Phelps, one of his books changed my life when I was younger. Same with Sarah. One of his books about the bipolar spectrum, as he is one of, if not the leading thinker and writer on this subject. So a bit about him. Dr. Phelps focused his practice on complex mood disorders for over 20 years. In addition to full-time patient care, from which he's now mostly retired, he has published multiple articles on bipolar disorders and the collaborative care model, which is a system of psychiatric consultation in primary care, something we could really use more of. He currently serves as research editor for the Psychopharmacology Institute. He prepares monthly quick take podcasts summarizing recent psychiatric articles, which are very useful because then you don't have to read the whole article. He is an emeritus member of the faculty for the psychiatric residency program in his hospital system. And he is the founder of a wonderful website, which Sally will throw in the chat, psycheducation.org, which has detailed information on bipolar disorders for both patients and families. His 2 books, one, Why Am I Still Depressed, which is for lay people, for patients. That's the one that Sarah and I read that really gave us a new look on our conditions. And also a spectrum approach to mood disorders, which is for professionals and highly interested lay people. Loving that one as well. So I'm a big fan of both these people. And I'm just so glad to have you guys here. Thank you so much. So I'm going to let Sarah take it away first.
Okay, thank you so much, Andrea. And Jim, great to see you. I really do credit Jim with saving my life, as you'll hear a little bit more about later. Alex, wherever you are, now you got me so calm that I don't know if I can give this talk, but I'm going to try and like hype it back up again. That was great, Alex. And thanks to DBSA, this is my first time being with the DBSA California crowd, so I appreciate you inviting me. It's a little bit later out here in Massachusetts where I am, almost 4 o'clock. So good afternoon, everybody. So as Andrea said, I have a bipolar brain, and if you looked at me now, I think where I am, you'd see what looks like a pretty nice middle-aged lady doing all right in the world. But I'm here to dig deeper with you into the story because, as you know, there's another side of the story. I wanted to say too, because it's the first time with DBSA, that I imagine there are a lot of folks on the line here who have a degree of awareness around bipolarity more than the average crew. So forgive me if you already know what I'm about to share, or if something that I'm saying doesn't exactly sit right with you. Jim and I have gone back and forth in some of the terminology that I use, or if it conflicts with your experience, please know that this is just one person's journey. And my hope is that you'll find some resonance with it and some healing in it. Like many of you out there, I'm here to crush the stigma, and I hope that what I'm about to share helps. So at age 21, I was a senior at a top university and who seemed to have it all. I was playing varsity sports. I had a gang of smart, feisty friends. And with a 4.0, I was heading to one of the best medical schools in the country in the fall. But then in what felt like the flip of a switch, it was as if an alien had abducted my brain. Suddenly, I couldn't add 2 + 3 when I'd aced calculus. I couldn't get out of bed. I locked myself in my room, afraid to see my beautiful friends. I was too confused to navigate my way to class, even though I'd been here for 4 years. It was a tailspin into a living hell, and I was terrified. I had no idea what was going on. In the decades that followed, I suffered from a debilitating brain disorder. Like Persephone in the underworld, I was caught in the grip of a brutal force, a prisoner of the darkness. as Andrea said, I kept this mostly secret for 40 years until last year when I came out with my story in the memoir. But I choose to tell my story and upcoming this film to do three things: save lives, end the stigma, and maximize healing. It took me 25 years, 7 medications, and 5 psychiatrists to finally get the diagnosis that saved my life. I have a bipolar 2 brain on the bipolar spectrum. So again, I imagine that many of us on the Zoom right now have heard of the bipolar spectrum, but most people I ask are completely unaware that bipolarity exists on anything like a spectrum. Even most healthcare professionals seem to be unaware of these brain patterns. I remember one of my therapists years ago, actually literally in tears after I'd gotten my diagnosis, apologizing that she didn't know. So we know that understanding the full spectrum and the distinction between bipolar 1 and 2, and then unipolar depression, and then acting on that knowledge can absolutely save lives. Here's how. So I imagine, like some of you out there, you could imagine you've been lethargic, unmotivated, unable to get out of bed. You drag yourself to your doctor. Doctor listens to you, judges that you're clinically depressed, and prescribes you an antidepressant, maybe something like Prozac. So I've learned in doing some research over the last couple of years that close to 79% of the prescriptions for antidepressants in this country are actually written by primary care physicians who most likely have not been trained to recognize or treat the bipolar spectrum. Indeed, my niece she's in a family care residency right now, and she told me they had exactly 1 month of psychiatric training. But if you're like me, you're not clinically depressed. You're actually bipolar 2. And that Prozac may act like poison for your brain. And since the suicide risk for people with any kind of bipolar is twice as high as for those with major depression, getting the diagnosis right is literally a matter of life and death. Now, I learned that it takes, on average, 11 years to diagnose a bipolar 2, 11 years. And that's just way too long, because in the meantime, we know that undiagnosed bipolar folks who are our family and friends and ourselves are among the addicted, the incarcerated, the homeless, careers destroyed, marriages ruined, and in the case of suicide, families left with a devastating gaping wound that may never be fully healed. But we know it doesn't have to end this way. So why is there so much misdiagnosis? So when you hear the word bipolar, what comes to mind? Again, this is a more educated group, but most people I've asked will describe something like this: wild highs, all night sprees, extreme mood swings. So they're actually articulating just the one end of the bipolar spectrum, which is classic bipolar 1, often known, as you know, as manic depression. However, now we know, thanks to the work of Jim Phelps and colleagues, that bipolar exists on this spectrum. And people with bipolar 2 brains like me do not show extreme mania. There's actually bipolar without mania, and people think that's like a, what's the word? Oxymoron, but it's not true. There is bipolar without mania. And because folks like me do not act manic, and we do have many of the same symptoms of regular depression, lethargy, despair, low affect, suicidal ideation, we are consistently, in most cases, misdiagnosed with clinical depression and then prescribed the wrong medications. I don't know if any of you out here have had this experience, but yep, Andrew's shaking her hand, right? And so why is this dangerous? So while people with bipolar 2 are waiting on average more than a decade, like I said, for me, it was a quarter century, for the right diagnosis, they may be given all kinds of drugs that are wrong for them. I read a study that Jim did, Jim and his colleagues, where they tracked a bunch of people who had gone, Jim, you'll correct me when you do your piece, as my memory serves me, they had been in primary care and they were given up to 27 medications, 27, okay? So we may be given the kinds of drugs that are wrong for us, each of these with dangerous and even lethal side effects. So in my case, and this is not true for everybody, again, it's my story, but in my case, doctors convinced that I was clinically depressed, gave me drugs that literally made my brain feel like it was shaking inside my skull. Anybody have that? Not pretty, right? So then I returned to the doctors much worse. They think, oh, okay, she's more depressed. Let's give her more of that drug, right? It's a brutal, vicious cycle. And we can get worse and dangerously worse. But now we know that bipolar 2 is not clinical depression. It is a form of bipolar, which can respond beautifully to bipolar specific medications like lithium and lamictal, lamotrigine, and others. I imagine Dr. Phelps will talk more about that in a minute. I'm not the pharmacologist, but I can tell you that they work for me and I love my drugs. And I sort of say that, half in jest because it took me so long to be willing to accept medication. So getting these diagnoses right is vital because, like we're saying, the wrong diagnosis and the wrong medication can make broken brains even worse, while the right diagnosis and medications can save lives, right? So here we go. Everybody take a drink of water. That's part of self-care. Yeah, okay, let's have another. So many of you may be familiar with this, but I try to describe to people what I mean by a broken brain and my experience of that, because I think when many people who are not familiar with their own mood challenges hear or see someone who looks depressed, they think about emotion. Oh, they're sad. Let's fix their sadness. And while that may be relevant, it's not how it is for me and millions of others. Because when my bipolar switch flips, my brain just stops working. I think it's a physical thing that then impacts the emotional and everything else. But here are a few examples of the impact on me, and I know there are many more. So simple everyday conceptual tasks I've taken for granted are nearly impossible. One day, it took me literally 3 full hours to unpack 2 bags of groceries. People don't get that, right? Why? I get lost between putting away the tomatoes and shelving the cereal. I'm in constant confusion. I can't sequence actions. I forget multiplication. This makes me miserable because I had 800s on my math SATs. Shopping malls and supermarkets become impossible. There are just too many choices. How long can I stand in an aisle trying to choose between peanut butters? The large or the small, the organic or the non-organic, the cheap or the higher priced. Angie's nodding her head, making me feel right. You're right with me, girl. These decisions are paralyzing. And then the inability to make decisions in the peanut butter aisle floods me with anxiety and shame. Getting dressed in the morning poses a similar challenge. What goes with what? How do I choose colors? If it's cold enough outside to need socks, and where I live, that's half the year, and there are none in my drawer, I simply can't go out. I stopped doing laundry because it's too overwhelming to go through the sequencing of folding, sorting, and putting away clothes. So in the office, in the bedroom, in the kitchen, things pile up. And it's not that I don't want to do dishes. I simply cannot do them. It's kind of crazy. To this moment, I actually enjoy doing dishes because now I can do them. But what happens is I hate the mess. The chaos makes me crazier. And yet I'm too embarrassed to invite anyone over into the scene, even though I'm desperate for company and I'm terrified to be alone with my brain. People have asked, and in my case, these periods of darkness and incapacity are mercilessly unrelenting, and they last for 9 months or more. I know that's different for everyone, but mine tend to be 9 to 12 months. And that's minute after minute, hour after hour, day after day, no break, no relief. It's too excruciating to live and too scary to die. And given my inability to function, I know if we're not for my supportive friends and family, and I think my husband might be on the line, so I got to give Joe a shout out. If it wasn't for these folks, I know I could be easily on the street or worse. So I share these descriptions not to depress you further, but for this. If you're suffering with a broken brain, I want you to know you're not alone. I want you to know that someone else knows what it's like to live in day in and day out with a brain like yours. And there's help and there's hope. That's why I wrote the book. I wanted to have a first person narrative where you could read it and go, oh, okay, she gets me. The doctor who finally diagnosed me correctly was dedicated to understanding the complexity of bipolar. And he used one of Dr. Phelps's books, which included a simple 11 question, I think it's 11, Jim, you can correct me, bipolar spectrum diagnostic test. So he asked me, did your first incident occur before age 25? And the answer is yes, it was 21. And do you have a family history of mood swings? Well, yep, my grandfather and my mother both suffered terribly. My mom called it the cruelest disease, and we watched her suffering. And he continued, when you were put on an antidepressant, did it maybe seem to work and then stop or make you worse? And I'm thinking, Yes, absolutely. My friends and family told me that I got more irritable, more agitated, more of a triggered temper that I don't usually have. So with that and a few more incisive questions, it took Dr. Perlman, with his white hair, he's been at this for 40 years, took him 15 minutes to correctly diagnose what had eluded the medical world for a quarter century. I am bipolar 2 on the bipolar spectrum. And the medications he prescribed as a result of this diagnosis gave me back my life. So some of you out there may understand, appreciate this, but I often find it hard to fully express the magnitude of this transformation, from the utter devastation and suicidal longings of that broken brain to the absolute miracle and awesome blessing of a brain that works, of me being able to speak with you now. I still get chills telling this story. You know, it's been a long time, but thank you, Dr. Phelps. So I don't know why the brain breakdown happens. Not even the experts that we've been talking to, the film seem to know. As I wrote in my memoir, Brainstorm from Broken to Blessed on the Bipolar Spectrum, and I have to say I'm very proud of it. So I got to show you. I like the cover. I wrote, the brain is as vast as the universe and equally uncharted. In years to come, I imagine we'll see how rudimentary our understanding was in this early 21st century. But meantime, we have a lot of work to do. So most people want to help. And I have to say, well, after I wrote this and people started coming back to me going, oh my God, I didn't know, I'm so sorry. How could I have missed this? And feeling guilty. And then people's like deer in the headlights, like, what should I do? I don't know how to help people. And, you know, my mother, my brother, my sister, whatever. So I say, like, if you've never experienced a broken brain, like the one I described, but know people are suffering, and most cases you do, according to NAMI right now, National Alliance on Mental Illness, 1 in 5 people in this country are living with some kind of mental health condition. That's over 60 million Americans. So I want you to know that as frustrating this may be, you cannot pull this person up by their bootstraps, cheer them on with your joie de vivre, or shame them to just do something already. And I've had these reactions. My mother suffered from this when I was younger, and I didn't have the compassion to have known. I would just be like, Mom, just get up and do something. So I understand the reactions are human, but they don't help. So here's what can help. And I call it your Emergency Mental Health Team Toolkit, EMT. I imagine many of you may be using approaches like this, but I think they're worth reviewing. So I call them 4 things. And this is what I've shared with people who've said, what do I do? So I say, 1, reach in. Don't expect them to reach out. They won't. There's too much shame, right? I think one of the earlier speakers mentioned that. So you make the phone calls, you knock on the door. The second thing is listen without judgment. Don't try to fix it, because you can't. Simply accompanying this person with your love and presence is healing. They're feeling isolated and in despair. You're showing up is a lifeline. Then the third thing is just do it. Okay, so this is for those of you who want to do something. Here's what you can do. You make the appointments, you drive them to doctors, you pick up the kids, you put away the groceries, you fill the freezer, you choose the peanut butters. Simple tasks like these are Herculean for your friend. You do them. And finally, I mean, you know, I think it's like, my husband just went through cancer. He's doing great, thank God. People would deliver meals. They don't deliver meals to folks who have a broken brain because we can't see it, right? So I'm saying deliver the meals, fill the freezer, choose the peanut butters. The last thing of the 4 is create a posse. So this is a support team for you. It's too much for any one person to handle. You're going to need backup so you don't burn out. But here's the good news. We know that the community of compassion and action that you build as a result will be beautiful and will serve you all. Somewhere down the line, you're going to need help, and those folks are there from you. So when you reach in instead of running away and you show up with your love and kindness, you are going to be a huge shame eraser, shame lifter. We talk about ending the stigma, ending the shame. The author Terry Cheney writes something that I love, this quote. She says, the disease feeds on shame, shame feeds on silence, and I will not be silent anymore, right? I would add that the shame feeds on stigma. We know there's still a massive stigma in this country against mental illness, though I think that's getting better now since the pandemic. It still exists. And people fearing the shame of the stigma don't ask for help. They don't seek out the life-saving help they need. So I pose that the stigma literally kills, and you're showing up help breaks this vicious cycle of shame, stigma, silence, more shame, more stigma. You're showing up can save a life. So for example, if you have a friend or family member who's too ashamed to take medication, as I was for decades, and so many are, please let them know that this is not their fault. If they had diabetes, they would take insulin. If they had heart disease, they might take blood thinners. If they had lung issues and trouble breathing, they'd use an inhaler without shame. So pancreas, heart, lungs, these are all physical organs, and so is the brain. That's why I like to say I have a bipolar brain. Not many people say that, but I like to make that distinction that it's a physical thing, right? So why do we treat diseases of the brain differently? It's time to stop that. My mentor, Juanita, who finally got me to accept medication, said, you don't deserve to suffer. You've done nothing wrong. This is genetic, which it is. This is physical. Just say yes to help. And because I loved and respected Juanita, so my mentor, and because I was hanging to life by a thread, and because by then I had 2 little kids who needed me, I listened. I just wish it hadn't taken me so long. And by the way, I wish I knew about DBSA. I don't know if you guys were around in 2006 and 7, but that's where I send people now. So here's what else you can all do for those of us who want to do something. And this is interesting because, of course, I hadn't heard Alex's or the gentleman before's presentation, but these, I call them practices for a healthy brain. And he used the acronym PECS, physical, emotional, creative, and spiritual. Flex your pecs. I think these all fit on the go from parasympathetic to parasympathetic, basically calm your nervous system. Although I wouldn't have used that terminology before hearing the previous speaker. But anyway, I practice PECS with religious discipline because I know my life depends on it. And I've learned to have a healthy respect for my bipolar brain. And I've also, as a result of doing research for the film, been learning more and more about the importance of maintaining our circadian rhythms when we have bipolar brains. I'm not as sure if that's as true for clinical depression on the other end. Jim will tell us. Andrew maybe knows. But anyway, circadian rhythm consistency is really important for people like me. So yes, good. But this is really good medicine for anyone with a brain, because we're all feeling a lot of stress these days. So the idea with the PECS is to create balance and stability in your day and do one or more in each of the 4 areas: physical, emotional, creative, or spiritual. As the poet Audre Lorde writes, this is not self-indulgence, it's self-preservation. So I have examples. I don't think I'm going to get into them too much because I want to give Jim a chance to talk and then more time for Q&A. But basically, they're examples of physical, like stretching, emotional connection, acts of creativity, painting, dancing, whatever, all the things that Alex was saying about calming. And then as a spiritual practice, I'm with you. I got to unplug. I got to get outside. I actually typically unplug one day a week, which is Saturday, exception today. I got to get outside every day. I did just before this talk. Beautiful day here in New England. So I'm uber disciplined about my PECS because the risk to my health if I don't do them. People go, wow, how come you're so disciplined? I'm like, you should see what happens with a broken brain, right? But the bonus is my friends and family tell me this discipline is inspiring and good for their health too. One of my friends said, you're my North Star on self-care. Who knew? Okay, self-care, one more drink here. This leads to me what want to leave you guys with, which I imagine other people in this network think about and talk about, but I call it bipolar pride, with all respect to LGBTQIA+ community. People like many of us here today who live with bipolar and other neurodiverse patterns, we have suffered in silence, fear, isolation, what Andrew would call self-stigma. We have internalized the vast social stigma that something is wrong with us, and we're riddled with shame. So is that okay with you? No. So I believe it's time to tell a different story now, a healing story. We're champions. Nobody told us that, but we are champions. We are survivors of internal terror who've risen like a phoenix from the ashes, and we've emerged with some beautiful qualities of soul and character. So here are a few I like to mention for. We're emotionally fearless friends. Basically, there's nothing that you can do to scare me off that my brain hasn't already done to me. We will not leave you. We are also pretty much off the charts compassionate, there, but for the grace of God, we could be on the street too, and we know it. We will not judge you. We are pretty disciplined about brain and self-care, and we can help you with your pecs. And my experience is gratitude beyond measure. And the gratitude can be contagious, because when you've been to hell and back, every healthy moment, every moment when your brain is working is a miracle. So let's celebrate the miracle. And that's what I got, my friends.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Such a beautiful story, such a beautiful human. It resonates so much with me. It really does. And I'm sure it resonates with so many people here. Thank you so much for coming on a Saturday, especially.
Thank you.
Well,
Can I just add a couple words to introduce Jim?
Of course, I was just going to say, if people have Q&A, make sure to throw them in the chat, because we are monitoring the chat. We'll do Q&A at the end.
We're going to do after Jim, right? So I want to just say I have the privilege of turning it over to my hero and now friend, Dr. Jim Phelps. Andrea agrees with me. I mentioned that Jim was the author of the book, Why Am I Still Depressed, with the bipolar diagnostic that saved my life 16 years ago.
We put it in the chat.
And in the interim, he was a huge champion of the book, encouraging me to publish it as a memoir. And now is on our film team as consulting psychiatrist and science advisor for the upcoming documentary. So I'm just so grateful to Jim, and excited to hear what you have to share.
Yes, and we threw the book into the chat so people can find their way to it. Both the books and the film and Psych Education. Everybody scroll up, can see all the links.
Great. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Andrea, and thank you all for being here today. Thanks to the DBSA of California to give us this chance, not to talk with you, but to sit and be here with you through this couple of hours has really been remarkable for me. Really remarkable. And it makes me feel like, I'm going to come on as the psychiatrist and I'm supposed to talk like I know something. And compared to what you all know, I don't know nothing, because I've learned from people like you in 30 years of practice. That's what I learned. That's where I learned most of what I know. And sitting with you all again through a couple of hours here reminds me of how much I learned in that way. I feel deep respect for you all and gratitude for having had that opportunity. And, I had some things that I thought, well, okay, this is what I want to try to convey in my opportunity, in my chunk of time. And it's like, poof, nah. Instead, I'm going to talk about some of the things that came to mind as I listened for the last couple of hours. And the biggest one is, and I wrote this on my website years ago, and I'm realizing, oh yeah, that was a big deal. I wrote a couple pages on depression is not a moral weakness. Depression is not a moral weakness. And that couple of pages on my website got a lot of attention, which made me realize, yeah, this is a really important message. And I heard that throughout again today. So I know that you all know this, and yet I thought perhaps maybe I can give you just a little bit more in the way of resources. Thank you, Alec, for a really nice job on your piece of work. Some more resources to kind of undergird that belief that depression is not a moral weakness. And those are some of the amazing new things that are happening in terms of research about mood disorders. I'm a bipolar disorder specialist mostly, but as has been mentioned, I think of mood disorders as existing on a spectrum from plain depression to bipolar disorders, and there's people all the way along in between. So when I think about mood disorders and what the research is, I think it applies almost all the way across all of this. Anyway, so in terms of bipolar disorder, what causes bipolar disorder? Where did Sarah's bipolar brain come from? What's different about her brain? And there are at least 4 major realms of research that are really cooking these days. And we're excited because we're going to try to present them in this documentary that we're working on. So I'm just going to summarize them now, and I'll just try to be brief because I'd really be just happy to answer questions. Suffice to say, the four are inflammation. It's amazing how our inflammatory system and our immune system have come to be central in the story of a mood disorder that you think brain, but no, it's not just brain, it's the whole immune and gut interaction that is playing a deep role in mood disorders. So what's going on in terms of inflammatory responses generally and in the gut microbiome in particular is a fascinating territory that's getting lots of attention these days. Just one study to illustrate that. At Johns Hopkins, research team there took a group of people who had been young adolescents who'd been hospitalized with mania and just looked to see if there was something different about their gut microbiome compared to people who were admitted for other reasons in other parts of the hospital. And sure enough, they found what they thought was sort of a pattern of more of particular organisms in the people who are admitted with bipolar mania. They then showed that the people who had the most of those microbiotic changes were the most likely to get readmitted in the next couple of years. I think it was a year or so. So their gut microbiome was predictive of their clinical course. And then I think, as far as I know, this is just a pilot so far. I'm waiting for the replication in the bigger study. Then they randomized many of these people who had been hospitalized to get a probiotic per day or a placebo. And then they watched, I think this went on for at least a year, and watched to see, can we prevent rehospitalization with a probiotic? And the answer was yes. So I'm sure you're all going, whoa, what was in that stuff? Tell me quick. And so we're not ready to be going, okay, that's the stuff. This needs to be replicated and needs to be understood further. But I just want you to know that there's something going on there in terms of understanding gut microbiome and treatment of mood disorders generally. Very exciting. Secondly, well, to tell you that there's a relationship between hormones and mood certainly doesn't need any explanation. Why is it, for example, that mood disorders generally, and particularly bipolar disorders, show up in late adolescence and early adulthood? It's because right around puberty, things start to change and people finally have the changes manifest enough by the time they're 18, 19, 20 for it actually to show up in their experience. For Sarah, it was 21, which is a little on the late side. One of the folks on our team for our film is General Greg Martin. He actually has a bipolar brain that became clear late in his life, but he was a very successful military man. He became a 2-star general before he finally had a manic episode. And his mood stuff was just building all his life. So it can be very late, but usually it's more like 18 to 20, and it looks like it's a manifestation of things having to do with our reproductive hormones, estrogen and testosterone. So there's a whole world of research now going on in terms of maybe there's a different way to go after mood. Maybe there's something having to do with, you may have heard of brexanolone. It's a treatment for postpartum depression, requires injections at this point. There's an oral version that is awaiting FDA approval, but it's like all of a sudden out of almost nowhere, we're looking at how hormonal interventions could treat mood disorders. Very interesting, very active area of research. Third out of 4 here is the realm of genetics. And it's really complicated territory, and yet one message is very clear now, and that is unlike Parkinson's, which has some rather strong genetic predictions, and Huntington's disease, which has a single gene disorder. It's turned out over the last couple of decades, to our disappointment in some ways, that mood disorders like depression and bipolar disorder are polygenic, many genes, each of which has a small effect, not one. So mood disorders are polygenic, particularly bipolar disorder, even though they're strongly genetic and clearly run in families, there isn't a single gene for it. There are many. And so it hasn't been possible to chase like the gene and figure out the treatment that would change what that gene does in the way that we had hoped a couple decades ago. Nevertheless, we're still looking at what's different about the genes and getting more insight through them in terms of the mechanisms of bipolar disorder. One of which is the last of these four. So that was inflammation, hormones, genetics, and the last is chronobiology, the influence, the relationship between our circadian rhythm and mood. And that is a very active area of research, particularly in bipolar disorder, but also applicable in plain depressions that are not bipolar. Very active area of research. And what's exciting is it's yielding treatment opportunities, including something called social rhythm therapy. So if we have time, maybe I'll talk a little bit about more social rhythm therapy. It's very similar to it's one ingredient in Sarah's PECs, and in the techniques. I heard Matthew talking about the importance of maintaining a regular sleep rhythm. So actually probably most of you, I would guess, have already figured out sleep has a big impact on mood course, and you need to be mindful about how you manage it. So chronotherapy is the fourth of these realms. I guess partly what I'm trying to convey is in the face of everything that you all have gone through, there is still room. In fact, there's progressively more room for excitement about what's being learned and the way that that learning can be turned into treatment opportunities. So I think that's my main message based on what I heard from you today. I've got a couple others, but I'm going to kind of stop there because I'd be more interested in hearing from you. and while you're thinking about what you might put in the chat, for example, I'll just tell you one more thing, and that is Tim Barry came on and said, mental health practitioners, we have, I think he put it, a sketchy past, and psychiatrists particularly have kind of a sketchy past. And I'm thinking that most of you, or many of you, and I fear that it's most of you, may have had kind of sketchy experiences with psychiatrists. If that's true, I apologize for my profession, and I am pleased to tell you that I think it's getting better. The people who are going into psychiatry nowadays, it used to be kind of the left wing outside crowd of the medical school students, but now it's the really sharp kids who are going into psychiatry because they're realizing this is a cool field to be part of. So I think there is hope there too. I think I'm going to stop there with one last plug for Sarah's book. It is so good. I read it standing in the kitchen when I took it out of the shipping container that she had sent it to me in, all the pages. It is so good. It is so gripping. And it is such a brilliant account of this bipolar 2 version of mood disorders. I recommend it just as an amazing read, as well as something that might be rather encouraging, seeing somebody else's experience and seeing how she can function now.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Jim. Thank you so much. I already have some questions for you guys, which is wonderful. It's always so inspiring to hear, we think about how far we've come, like Sarah said, but then to think that there's actually still more that might help us in the future. Whenever I get down and out about my own condition, my mother always says, well, you don't know what's coming. You don't know what you don't know. You don't know what has yet to be discovered. So that's really inspiring to hear. So couple of questions. Let's see here. Sarah, do you still have symptoms? And if so, how do you cope?
I feel like I'm one of these people that's exquisitely fortunate with medication, because I know it doesn't work. It took me 7 meds and, Jim's helpful diagnosis, a long time, 25 years to get to that place. But I think partly why I'm pretty stable is because in addition to those medications, I am really rigorous about brain care. I mean, as an example, family went to Europe over the summer, which was the privileged thing. I didn't go because I was concerned about circadian rhythms and the 6-hour time difference. And I know that's real. Like Jim could speak more about that. I you know, I try to get to bed by 10. I'm going to be in bed by 11 at the latest, lights out. I stopped drinking. I never was a heavy drinker. I came from a family of some heavy drinkers, but yeah, I drank pretty consistently. I started to notice that with my meds, it was not helping. And I don't drink anymore. It's not like I have to be cold turkey. If it's a glass of wine once a week, it's fine. But I've just I think what's happened evolved over time, because I'm also old. See these guys? And I've been dealing with this for a long time, is that I've just gotten more and more curious about the impact of behaviors. You know, like, what if I'm doing more sugar or less? What if I'm sleeping more or less? What if I'm drinking more or less? And noticing like, wow, these things really have an impact. So while I don't think that, I know that if I'm in the midst of a bipolar depression, going to bed on time is not going to fix me. Not stopping sugar is not going to heal that. But I think as a preventive, and I'd be interested to hear what Jim has to say about this too. I think as a preventive, those behaviors can really make a difference. And I don't want to like freak anybody out. You got to do them all at once. But over time, as you start to develop things that you learn are useful for your body. Another one, this gut brain thing is really true. So, you know, having more, you know, drinking more kombucha. This is stuff right here that I've been drinking. I'm not doing an advertisement for that, but just to say it's probiotics. You know, so just being more mindful of like, okay, what can it's kind of a fine-tuned thing here, this bipolar body. So let's be really mindful of what we can do preventively. What do you think, Dr. Phelps?
Thank you.
I'll just add, you know, it could be easily overwhelming to think about all the things that you need to do and be careful of, and gets in the way of actually being able to enjoy life in a rich way. So we could try to rank order the things in terms of which of these things are the most important. And there's one that rises to the top, I think, particularly in light of this new chronotherapy research. And this may not be true for everybody here, but I suspect for the majority of people here, having a regular bedtime and a regular rise time is an important way to lock in your circadian rhythm. So this is the main ingredient in so-called social rhythm therapy, a regular bedtime and a regular rise time. Once you have been able to establish them, then cranking them in the direction of going to bed earlier and getting up earlier, like closer to the sun, is kind of a second step in social rhythm therapy that I think helps stabilize your rhythm further, because now the sun's rhythm and your rhythm are in sync or closer. And when they're not, it tends to decrease the power of your own circadian rhythm to drive sleep. So you can strengthen your circadian rhythm by having a regular pattern and by having it closer to the sun. That's the core ingredients, I think, in social rhythm therapy. And I think it is one of the most important ingredients in self-care of mood disorders, especially those that are on that spectrum from plain old depression to bipolar disorder, especially for the people over in the who have more bipolarity mixed in to their experience of depression. Sarah and I've been working on this lingo. How did I do there, Sarah? I think we got it. Okay, thank you. So I think that's, for many people, not everyone, one of the most important. And then the rest of Sarah's program, so physical activity, emotional health, creativity, and a spiritual component, her PECS program, I wouldn't dare prioritize them, because I think for everyone, those might be somewhat different. The circadian component, I think, obviously, I think that is one of the most important. So I'm just trying to help, if you're going to think about the things that are most important to you and rank order them so that you don't have to containerize your life too much.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. As a future psychologist, right up there with sleep is just so important. Dr. Phelps, I have a question for you, and I have a question for both of you. So question is, how can I talk to a doctor who doesn't have a concept or understanding of the bipolar spectrum? I know Sarah struggled with this. I was very lucky. I took your book to my psychiatrist and said, I think I have bipolar disorder. And she said, sweetie, I know that. I was very young. So she was way ahead of me. I know Sarah struggled with finding doctors who got it. What would you suggest saying, say you have a psychiatrist you really trust and you really fit with, and they don't have a concept? What could you recommend?
Yeah, I wrote an essay once about how to talk with doctors, because nowadays it's very hard to get one. So having a psychiatrist, psychiatric nurse practitioner, you may be lucky just to have them. It's not easy to just go, well, I'm going to go off and get a second opinion, or maybe I'm going to shop around. You may be effectively stuck with this person, in which case you end up having to kind of help them figure out how to help you. So number one, learning a lot yourself so that you feel more kind of solid with, here are the reasons why I think this is what I've got diagnostically. And here are the reasons why I think this treatment might be a good idea for me. So learning a lot to really be secure in those beliefs about what you're going to go and present, that will help. So number one, learning. Number two, it may be very difficult, but it may be very difficult. And treating the person with respect in terms of recognizing that they are there trying to help you, even though sometimes it may not be really obvious. So operating with the presumption that they are there to try to help you. And what you're trying to do is align with them. Tim Berry called it the collaboration, right? The importance of collaboration. You're trying to align with them in this attempt to help you. And so you're trying to sidle up to them and say, I know what you're trying to do here is to help me. And I really appreciate what you've done and everything that you're doing on my behalf. And I'm wondering if, then you kind of scratch your head, kind of Dumbo Columbo, if you remember the Columbo movie show. I'm just wondering what if we headed off in this direction? Do you think that might help? Now, that might sound kind of obsequious or like putting yourself in a one-down position. And in some respects it is, but it's strategic in order to go somewhere. That's the short answer to that question.
I think
If
that's
I could just add, Andrew, real quick. I think, being self-advocates with our doctors, a lot of them don't know what we know. Most of them don't know if you're talking about the bipolar spectrum. So that's why I literally walked in with Jim's book to my psychiatrist and said, here on page 52, it looks like low dose lithium might help with my Lamictal. What do you think? And he knew Jim from International Society of Bipolar Disorders. He'd heard his talks and he was like, let's try it. I mean, he would not have thought of that. Turns out this is working very well for me. I can't prescribe, right? But the point being just, I think we need to be our own advocates, bring Jim's book, bring my book, bring whatever book, and find that sweet spot where you can help. I know we have another story for the film. Our director is on the line here, Bonnie Walsh. We interviewed a young man in his 20s and his mother, who said that they basically did that. They took the book, they figured out, they thought they knew his diagnosis. Their doctor and therapist didn't have a clue. Luckily, they were open to it. And now he has bipolar spectrum diagnosis and the right meds, and he's doing great. So yeah, we got to advocate for ourselves.
Definitely. So Jim, it looks like now we've talked about 3 people in the last 2 minutes who have taken your book into the doctor's office and said, hey doc, what do you think about this? And it worked. So that's amazing. That's truly amazing.
I will say, and it sounds like people are plugging my book, but the book was invited by the publisher because I'd written this website, and the website was my attempt at self-defense. 20 years ago, I was regarded as an outlier because I talked about this bipolar spectrum, and so I said, well, let me just write down on a website and I can stick in the references to all these assertions that I'm making. And I'm not an outlier. I was trying to defend myself. Well, 20 years later, finally, this spectrum way of thinking about mood disorders is finally now getting relatively solidly established amongst mood specialists around the world. So it's been a long haul waiting for that validation. The book just happened to come along in the middle of it. I'm very, very glad that it's been of use to some people.
Yeah, and the clinician's book as well is wonderful. So there's a question that someone had that both you might be able to answer. It's more of a bigger picture question. So bringing up and discussing building and having social support, not necessarily peer support, for people with bipolar disorder or depression, housing, community, emergency housing, employment, access to treatment. How do we deal with, and this might be kind of out of the realm, but I think it's a good topic to discuss. How do we deal with those sort of more basic needs? If you think of the hierarchy of needs, those that are sort of fundamental.
We're going to defer to you, Jim, on that for first shot, because I know you've been in the public health domain or trying to make kind of amplify your impact because of the dearth of psychiatrists, not enough out there. So what have you noticed that's working?
Well, first of all, I have not looked specifically at this area. So when asked a question, the first thing I want to do is go, well, I'm sure some smart people have written a recent review about this. I should go read that before I say anything. I don't have a prepared answer for that. And the reason I'm fumbling is because this is a huge social issue. This takes us almost outside of medicine and into politics and economics. Medicine is being forced to medicalize social problems and then treat them, which is very unfair to medicine, and we don't do a very good job of it. So housing and financial means in order that people have enough food to eat and shelter and are warmly clothed, it's like, this shouldn't be up to doctors to have to try to figure this out. So I think that's my short fumbling attempt at an answer to that question.
Yeah, and I do think it's a very hard question to answer, but I do kind of want to give it some airtime because it is so important. I think we all know that, and it should be kind of in the back of all of our minds how we can do that, not to support others emotionally, but just in a more systemic way, how we can support them. What tips do you have for someone recently diagnosed with bipolar disorder who doesn't know where to begin to get help? So obviously they've been diagnosed, they've gotten that much help. After that, what kind of help should we recommend that they receive?
You want me to go? Well, I assume if they got the diagnosis, then maybe hopefully they have they're getting medication. And I talk, hopefully, maybe. I mean, I talk as someone who's a little bit got religion because, like I said, I was against meds. I'm like this, crunchy, earthy, granola, all the stereotypes. Living in the woods, and I didn't want to do any medicine, and I had my own psychiatric issues because my mom was depressed on meds, and I didn't want to be her. So that's a whole other book. God bless her, she's in the next world now. But at any rate, so it took me a long time to accept the need for medication. And then once I was willing to, I was lucky to find meds that work, and that's like a miracle. So hopefully if they have a diagnosis, I would encourage them to try to find some kind of something that's going to work there. I learned from two of the other doctors involved in the film, Dr. Holly Schwartz and Tricia Supes, this a four-pronged approach. I put it in a diamond. I always put in diamonds. But one is medication. The other is support. We've all been talking about like your support network, social support, friends, get them circled around you. At least find a few people that you feel comfortable sharing with. In the beginning, it may be only a couple people, but building the social network. The third one is therapy, if that's helpful, if you have access to it. And then the fourth is PECS, is basically self-care, basic whatever, though, as an example, when I first figured out my bipolar disorder diagnosis, and I got on Jim's website, Jim, this is a big plug for you, psycheducation.org. I learned a lot of stuff there that I didn't know. For example, you got to get to bed before 10. You need to get off these devices. If you're going to stay on the devices, use amber glasses. Why do we want amber glasses? Because they block the blue light. Why do you want to block the blue light? Because they screw up our circadian rhythms. So I think there's one of the good, I always tell people like, they'll say, my kid just got a bipolar diagnosis. And I'll say, great, that's such good news. I'm only being half facetious because now there's a lot of stuff you can do. Send them to Jim's website, look at all the, ways you can be proactive in your own care, getting to bed, amber glasses, gut brain. If you're somebody who wants to be proactive, there are things you can do, and it's treatable, which is great. Not everything is. Jim, you can tell your story about why you got into bipolar right now. And I think the other thing is DBSA, make that connection. And I also recently, there's a guy called Paul English, if any of you remember the kayak travel app. He's the kayak guy, and he is also bipolar 1, and he started something called the Bipolar Social Club. You can look it up. Andrew, you can maybe put it in the chat. And if you're bipolar and you want to, you can get on the e-serve, the e-list, that listserv, which I found really helpful. People are, it feels like you're part of a community and we're sharing resources. There it is. Yeah, so you can join that. So there's more and more. But Jim, why did you decide to be a bipolar doc? There was something good about that, right? So
Um, I'll take that. Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, because I feel like sort of cheated in psychiatry. There are lots of things in psychiatry that are hard to help people get really a lot better. But mood disorders and bipolar disorders in particular, people can go from really, really ill in terms of debilitated. Their life is a mess. We just listened to Matthew's story today, and in the way he describes it, he's doing so well now. It's just a gift to us to hear. Same with Sarah. But starting from doing so badly and now doing so well. Well, as a psychiatrist, that's a privilege to be traveling along with that and to try to facilitate it. So yeah, so first thing is, as Sarah says, oh, new diagnosis of bipolar disorder. Oh, good. Well, the prognosis for most people is very good. So taking encouragement, making sure that you're comfortable with that diagnosis. There are more diagnostic assessments that can be done. There's a couple in my books. The bipolar spectrum diagnostic scale was one that Sarah did, recognizing that family history, age of onset, course of illness, how bumpy is it, and did you get worse on antidepressants? All of those are part of the diagnostic assessment that belongs to bipolar disorders. So being comfortable with the diagnosis. And then when you're looking at treatment options, first we start with the ones that have the fewest side effects and the least long-term risks if they have enough clout to address your symptoms. So non-pill approaches first. Sarah's physical, emotional, creative, spiritual attention to these factors, her PECs. Social rhythm therapy in terms of a regular bedtime and a regular rise time. Those are like the foundational ingredients. And then on top of that, for probably most people with bipolar disorders, we don't actually know how many of those people, like particularly in the middle of the mood spectrum, could be treated just with PECs and social support and social rhythm therapy and don't need lamotrigine or low-dose lithium. But I'm fond of lamotrigine and low-dose lithium because they have lamotrigine, for example, no long-term risks that we know of, and it's been around for several decades. Low-dose lithium has a whole different risk profile compared to high-dose, full-dose lithium. The latter has some known risks. The low-dose lithium has very few. If you're one of the 9 people out of 10 who can tolerate it without feeling dull and flat and blah, which unfortunately about 1 person in 10 does. So I think in terms of when we start about thinking about treatment options, I'm thinking really long term. You don't necessarily have to take these for all of your life. You need to take them long enough to get your life really well established and know what life is like when mood is stable. And then you can talk with your provider about very carefully tapering things off if you're determined to. So we're not talking about lifelong necessarily. We're talking something that's going to take a while, though. So let's use the things that have low risk and low potential for side effects. I start there, not necessarily the big guns with the greatest demonstrated efficacy for symptoms, unless your symptoms are so bad and so acute that we need to do it that way.
Yeah. Can I just add to like a practical example? So when I had my preemie twins, I did not yet have a bipolar diagnosis. One preemie twin had a breathing issue. I, being mom, was up all night long with that kid with breathing treatments to keep her alive. Would I do that again? Yes. However, I didn't know that sleep deprivation was the recipe for disaster for a bipolar brain. I hadn't got my diagnosis yet, nor had I read Jim's, website and all the stuff we know now about circadian rhythms. So how would I do it differently now that I have that? If I'd had the diagnosis then, well, get some help. Don't be the only person giving those breathing treatments in the middle of the night. Okay, husband, you're on. Whereas at that point, I don't know, I was like, it had to be me, because that's just my personality and because the kid wanted mom, right? But now I would know, it's like, you know what? No, your life is at risk here and your kids are going to need you without a bipolar breakdown. So you get the partner, if you're lucky enough to have one who will get out of bed, or get some friends, get somebody. You have to take this seriously. Like this sleep thing really makes a difference. So I think having understanding and respecting, I call it respect for my bipolar, respecting that diagnosis and knowing that these kinds of behaviors really can make a life and death difference, that's good.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So we have
Somebody's
two more questions.
nodding her head. Rosemary's going, yep.
Yeah, we're a lot of bubble dolls here, right?
Yeah.
One quick medical question and one for both of you to wrap up with. So someone's interested in kombucha and probiotics, as we were talking about, but they mentioned that there's sugar in some of these. Water kefirs from sugar. Would that amount of sugar be a concern, do you think?
Unknown.
Fair enough. Fair enough, but worth asking. And it's good that that person's concerned also about what other things they're putting into their body that might cause inflammation. So that's good to see.
You can do probiotics without sugar, though. I mean, yogurt, plain yogurts, sauerkraut, miso. There's lots.
Yeah.
Make your own kefir.
Wow, cool. We'll do that on a separate education day. Hands-on. Great. So one last question. At the same time, Sally's going to put the link to the evaluation in the chat. Please fill it out with your full information so you can be automatically entered in this drawing to win an iPad or a iPhone or a Kindle, your choice.
And Andrea, before last question or before the end, can we also just put a little plug for the upcoming film?
Yeah,
which you're also on the Science Advisory Board of?
Go right ahead. Yeah.
Andrew's on the Science Advisory Board. I just wanted to put the link in the chat because it's interesting too.
We'll put it again for sure.
It's brainstormthefilm.com, and we're going to have a meet the team coming up. Brainstorm the Film, including Jim and the filmmakers, Emmy Award-winning filmmakers and PBS documentarians and some other really impressive bipolar research docs, and then others with lived experience, like Jim said, our General Greg Martin and Dr. Deva Kubushan. For you, those of you in California may remember, she was acting Surgeon General, et cetera, earlier. So we're excited about it. It's going to be, its intention is to be the first of its kind. It's specifically about the bipolar spectrum, and it's going to include three things. One, people with lived experience, then secondly, cutting edge science, and then breakthrough treatments. So I want you guys to know about that.
Yeah.
And there it is. She put it up there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Promises to be really, you missed when we were talking, we put all your links in, but we can put them again. Yeah, promises to be really a boon for bipolar disorder and getting the word out there about so many things, treatments, knowledge, just connecting people. So my last one, and you guys are going to jump all over this, I know. What books, podcasts, videos, or other media do you recommend for understanding and overcoming mental health challenges? We've got the books, we've got everybody's books, we've got everybody's websites, got everybody's films. Anything else that might have made a difference to you personally, professionally, Sarah and Jim?
Oh, well, good question. I mean, I don't, I'm kind of like a one note person, I guess. The first book that really inspired me and changed my orientation in life was Kay Jamison's An Unquiet Mind, which just blew me away because she described what it was like inside my brain. Like I was just talking to you guys, broken brain. It was the first person that I ever met. First thing I'd read that was like, oh, she gets it. Then I wrote my book with that intention to be the Kay Jamison for bipolar 2, for people to have a sense that, okay, somebody gets me. And, Jim's books, all of Jim's books, which are on psycheducation.org. What else have I been listening to and reading? Drawing a blank right now besides DBSA. And
I'll jump in.
Pardon?
I'll jump in.
Yeah, thanks.
I am a believer in science and that there are advances that are taking place and that watching them advance is very exciting. So simply by Google searching and then being very careful about the quality of information that you're being given. There's just so much information out there, and so much that is moving quickly. I'm actually more of a fan of following the research as it's emerging rather than waiting for books which tend to be almost out of date by the time they show up. So watching for emerging literature by Googling things that you're really interested in, and then being very careful about the quality of the information that you're being given there.
So then that's reminding me then, I think ISBD, the International Society of Bipolar Disorders, that their conference is open to the public. And I think if you're a person with lived experience, you get to register for cheap, because I just did. And there's, it's a lot, it's breaking news, right? Breaking science cutting edge science there. That's going to be over like summer solstice in Chicago, but I think it's hybrid. I don't remember exactly.
I think it's only in person this year.
Is it only in person?
The first year
Andrew is a
that's in
big ISBD person, so you
Yeah.
could speak more about that, but there's a lot of really interesting talks, including yours, right?
Yeah, it's in
Andrea?
Chicago. So if anybody's local or wants to take a road trip, come on down. I think all three of us will be there, right?
Yep, we're going to be there. And a lot of these people that we've been interviewing for the film, really interesting folks that are doing, themes seem to be inflammation, circadian rhythms, mitochondria. Bonnie, tell me what else in the chat. What else have we been, there's 3 or 4 like major themes, hormonal, like Jim said, perinatal.
So DBSA will certainly do a screening of the film when it comes out. I hope that everyone will come back and see it. It'll be really great. Maybe have
Oh
another
yeah,
talk.
that'd be great.
But yeah, I mean, I can't thank both of you enough. This is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. 'Cause this runs very much in my family. Actually, gallops through my family, I think is more appropriate. So can't thank you both enough. Again, everybody take a minute to get the survey link out of the chat so you can fill it out. Any closing words from my partners in crime here, from Sally, Jeff, Sarah, Jim? Any last words? Any last questions?
Just thank you so much. I really
Thank you
appreciate
guys
this
so much.
network.
Yeah,
And
thank
sure
you,
this
Andrea. This was
everybody.
fantastic.
Paul, thanks for inviting us.
Thank you.